I've always found something rather soothing about the rain. The gentle patter against a roof, the rhythmic drumming on leaves, the way it washes the world clean. But not anymore. Now, when I hear rain, I remember that night in Cherokee National Forest. The night everything changed. Are you sitting somewhere comfortable right now? Perhaps with a cup of tea, listening to the rain outside your window? I envy that simple pleasure. I used to enjoy it too. It was supposed to be a solitary weekend trek. Just me, my thoughts, and the ancient trees of the Cherokee National Forest. I'd been there countless times before, knew the trails like the back of my hand. Or at least, I thought I did. The weather forecast had mentioned a slight chance of showers. Nothing to worry about. I packed light, tent, sleeping bag, 3 days worth of provisions and my trusty camera. Photography was my passion then. I wanted to capture the misty mountains at dawn, maybe spot some wildlife if I was lucky. The drive from Knoxville took about 2 hours. I remember humming along to the radio. Windows cracked just enough to let in that earthy scent that precedes rainfall. By the time I reached the ranger station near the trailhead, dark clouds had begun to gather overhead. The ranger, a weathered man in his 60s with crinkles around his eyes, looked up from his logbook as I entered. "Bit late to be heading out, isn't it?" he asked, glancing at his watch. It was just past 4 in the afternoon. "Just an overnight at Sylvan Springs," I replied. "I've done it dozens of times." He nodded, but something in his expression gave me pause. Signed the register, then. Storm might be rolling in heavier than they thought. If you change your mind, no shame in turning back. I should have listened. God, why didn't I listen? The first hour of hiking was uneventful. The forest welcomed me with its familiar symphony. Birds calling, leaves rustling, the crunch of the trail beneath my boots. The air grew heavier with moisture, carrying that distinctive petrichor scent. I've always found it comforting. That smell, its primal somehow, connects you to something ancient. The rain started as a gentle mist around the 2-hour mark. I paused to pull on my waterproof jacket, not particularly concerned. I'd hiked in worse conditions. But within 20 minutes, the skies opened up properly. The rainfall wasn't violent, just persistent, steady, the kind that soaks through everything eventually, no matter how waterproof you think your gear is. By 6 o'clock, the light was fading fast, obscured by both the dense canopy overhead and the thickening storm clouds. I decided to make camp earlier than planned, finding a small clearing about half a kilometer off the main trail. There was a shallow overhang of rock nearby that would provide some additional shelter. Have you ever set up a tent in the rain? It's a miserable business. By the time I'd finished, my fingers were numb with cold. Clothes plastered to my skin. I changed into dry clothes inside the tent, fired up my portable stove, and prepared a simple meal of instant noodles. The steam fogged up my glasses and warmed my face. For a moment, I felt content again, listening to the rain pattering against the nylon above my head. That's when I first heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind, a low, moaning sound somewhere in the distance. But there was something about it that pricked the hairs on the back of my neck. Something almost vocal. I switched off my torch and sat perfectly still, straining to hear beyond the rainfall. Nothing for several minutes. Then again, a sound between a sigh and a moan, definitely human-like, carried on the damp air. "Hello," I called out, immediately regretting it. My voice sounded thin and reedy against the vastness of the forest. No response. I told myself it was nothing, perhaps a deer or the wind playing tricks. The forest is full of strange acoustics, especially in the rain. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag and tried to read a bit on my phone, but the sound had unsettled me more than I cared to admit. Sleep came fitfully. I kept jolting awake, certain I'd heard something moving outside the tent. The rain continued unabated, drumming its monotonous rhythm. Sometime around what must have been midnight, I woke to absolute silence. The rain had stopped. In that strange, suspended moment, I heard it clearly, footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling my tent. My heart leapt into my throat. I lay frozen, barely breathing. The footsteps completed one circuit, then paused directly in front of the tent entrance. Who's there? My voice cracked embarrassingly. Nothing, just the drip, drip, drip of water from the trees. Then a whisper, so close it could have been inside the tent with me. Are you lost too? I've never felt terror like that moment. Cold sweat broke out across my body. My chest constricted so tightly I thought I might be having a heart attack. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, could barely breathe. The voice came again, slightly louder. I can hear you breathing. Something, a hand, I think, pressed against the side of the tent, creating an indent in the fabric. I could see the outline of fingers, unnaturally long and thin. Fight or flight finally kicked in. I scrambled for my torch and phone, hands trembling so violently I dropped both twice before managing to grip them. The torch beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the tent walls. The handprint was gone. Hello? I called again, voice steadier than I felt. I'm armed. A lie, but hopefully a convincing one. Only the forest answered me, the wind picking up again, bringing with it the return of rainfall. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat upright in my sleeping bag, torch in one hand, pocket knife in the other, watching the tent walls for any movement. When the first gray light of dawn began to filter through, I nearly wept with relief. Packing up was a blur. I left half my things behind in my haste. The stove, some food, even my beloved camper. All I wanted was to get back to the car, back to civilization, back to safety. The rain had turned the trail into a treacherous mudslide. I slipped countless times, once wrenching my ankle painfully, but fear drove me forward. Something felt wrong about the forest that morning. The usual birdsong was absent. The trees seemed to lean in closer, watching. Have you ever felt pursued? Not just followed, but hunted? It's a primal sensation, a deep-seated knowledge that you are prey. That's how I felt as I stumbled down that trail, my breath coming in ragged gasps, eyes darting wildly at every shadow. About an hour into my desperate retreat, I realized I had made a terrible mistake. In my panic, I'd taken a wrong turn. The trail I was on wasn't familiar anymore. It narrowed, grew wilder, less maintained. My phone had no signal, and in the overcast morning, I couldn't use the sun to orient myself. I was lost. Panic bubbled up inside me, threatening to overwhelm reason. I forced myself to stop, to breathe deeply, to think. The ranger station couldn't be more than a few hours away in any direction. I just needed to find a main trail again. That's when I spotted it. A figure standing between two distant trees. Just a silhouette, unmoving, watching me. Hello. I called, desperation overriding caution. I'm lost. Can you help me? The figure didn't respond, didn't move. I took a step towards it. It took a step back, maintaining the distance between us. Please, I called. I need help. The figure raised one arm, pointing deeper into the forest, away from where I thought the ranger station might be. Something about the gesture made my skin crawl. I shook my head and turned away, determined to find my own path back. That's when I heard it again, that same whisper from the night before, somehow right beside my ear despite no one being there. Everyone gets lost eventually. I ran like I've never run before, blind with terror, branches whipping at my face, mud sucking at my boots. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to buckle. And all the while I heard it, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, sometimes impossibly on both sides at once. Soft laughter, like rainfall on leaves. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to stretch and contract strangely. The forest grew darker despite it being morning. The trees pressing closer. The path narrowing until it was barely there at all. And then, suddenly I burst into a clearing. In the center stood a cabin I'd never seen before in all my years of hiking these woods. It was old, weathered gray with age, but there was smoke curling from the chimney. Safety. Help. Relief flooded through me. I staggered to the door and knocked frantically. Hello? Please, I need help. The door creaked open slowly. An elderly man peered out, his face a maze of wrinkles, eyes pale blue and surprisingly sharp. Well now, he said, voice like gravel. What's got you in such a state? Words tumbled out of me. The night visitor, getting lost, being followed. The man listened impassively, then stepped aside. Best come in, then rain's picking up again. Indeed it was. Fat drops beginning to fall from the leaden sky. I stepped gratefully into the warm, dimly lit interior of the cabin. It was a single room, sparsely furnished but neat. A fire crackled in a stone hearth. The scent of something cooking, stew perhaps, filled the air. My stomach growled, reminded me I hadn't eaten since the previous evening. Sit. The old man gestured a chair by the fire. Dry yourself. Name's Elias. Thank you, Elias. I'm James. I sank into the chair, the warmth of the fire immediately beginning to thaw my frozen extremities. Elias moved to a pot hanging over the fire, stirring its contents slowly. Don't get many hikers this deep in. Trail doesn't come this way. I got lost, I repeated. I think someone was following me. Elias glanced at me, something unreadable in his pale eyes. Folks say these woods are haunted. Cherokee legends, old spirits, walkers between worlds. He shrugged. Just stories to scare children, most likely. But there was something in his tone that suggested he didn't believe that. Have you heard anything strange? At night, I asked hesitantly. Elias ladled stew into a wooden bowl. The forest speaks, if you know how to listen. He handed me the bowl and a spoon. Eat. You look half dead. The stew was delicious, rich, hearty, warming. As I ate, the terror of the morning began to recede. Perhaps I'd imagined it all. Stress, isolation, darkness. They can play tricks on the mind. How do I get back to the ranger station from here? I asked between spoonfuls. Elias settled into a chair opposite me. Can't go now. Storm's coming in proper. Be dark soon anyway. He nodded toward a narrow cot in the corner. You'll stay the night. I'll point you right in the morning. Disappointment and relief warred within me. I didn't relish another night in the forest, but the cabin was secure. Elias seemed kind enough, and the alternative was potentially wandering lost as darkness fell. Thank you, I said sincerely. I can pay you for the trouble. Elias waved a gnarled hand dismissively. No need. Company's payment enough out here. As evening drew in, the rain intensified, becoming a solid wall of water that obscured the view from the cabin's small windows. Elias was quiet but not unfriendly. occasionally stoking the fire or adding a log. I tried asking about his life in the forest, how long he'd been there, but he deflected with vague answers or changed the subject. When night had fully fallen, he rose stiffly. "I sleep yonder." He nodded to a curtained alcove I hadn't noticed before. "You take the cot. One thing, though." His eyes fixed on mine with sudden intensity. "No matter what you hear in the night, don't open the door. Don't even look outside. You understand?" A chill ran through me despite the warmth of the fire. "Why? What's out there?" "Nothing good in these woods after dark," he said simply. "Promise me." "I promise," I replied, throat suddenly dry. Elias nodded, satisfied. "Sleep well then." I lay on the cot, listening to the rain hammering on the roof and the occasional crackle of the dying fire. Despite my exhaustion, sleep eluded me. Elias's warning had reawakened all my fears from the previous night. I must have dozed eventually, because I jerked awake sometime later to absolute silence. The rain had stopped again. The fire had died to embers, casting a faint red glow across the cabin floor. And someone was knocking at the door, soft at first, then more insistent. "Knock, knock, knock." I lay paralyzed, remembering Elias's warning. From behind the curtain came the sound of deep, rhythmic breathing. He was asleep. "Hello." A voice called from outside. A woman's voice, young, frightened. "Please, is anyone there? I'm lost. I need help." My promise warred with my instinct to help. It could be a genuine hiker in trouble, just as I had been. "Please," the voice called again, breaking slightly. "I'm scared. I think something's following me." I slid silently from the cot and crept to the door. Elias's warning echoed in my mind. But what if this was a real person in danger? How could I live with myself if something happened to her? Because I was too afraid to open the door. Through a crack in the curtains, I could make out a figure on the porch. A young woman, drenched in rain, arms wrapped around herself. My hand moved to the latch. "Don't!" I nearly jumped out of my skin. Elias stood behind me, eyes gleaming in the dim light. "But there's someone." "No!" He cut me off. "There isn't." As if hearing him, the woman's voice changed, deepened. "Let me in, James. I just want to talk to you." Ice flooded my veins. I'd never told the voice my name. The knocking became pounding, the door shuddering in its frame. The voice outside was no longer even trying to sound human. It had become a guttural growl, interspersed with that same soft laughter I'd heard in the forest. "What is it?" I whispered to Elias. "Old as these mountains," he replied grimly. "Hungry, patient. It finds those who wander too deep, calls to them with voices they trust or need." The pounding abruptly stopped. Silence stretched, taut as a bowstring. Then a new sound, scratching. Slow, deliberate. Fingernails on wood, tracing patterns across the door. "It can't come in unless invited," Elias said quietly. "Old rules still hold, even for old things." I backed away from the door, heart hammering against my ribs. "Will it leave?" Elias sighed heavily. "Come dawn, yes. It doesn't like the light." He settled back into his chair. "Try to sleep. It'll be a long night." Sleep was impossible. The scratching continued for hours, occasionally interrupted by knocking or voices. Sometimes a woman, sometimes a child crying, once what sounded exactly like my mother calling my name with increasing desperation. That was the hardest to resist. I actually got to my feet before Elias's firm hand on my shoulder pushed me back down. "It's not her," he reminded me gently. Your mother isn't lost in Cherokee forest in the middle of the night. Of course he was right. My mother was home in Bristol, probably watching late-night telly with the cat on her lap. The thing outside was playing on my fears, my instincts, as Elias had predicted. When the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the windows, the noises ceased. Silence settled over the cabin once again, broken only by the drip of water from the eaves. "It's gone," Elias announced, peering out the window. For now, what would have happened? I asked if I'd open the door. Elias looked at me, his pale eyes suddenly seeming much older than his face. "No one knows for certain. Those who open the door don't come back to tell." He prepared a simple breakfast, cornbread and strong, black coffee. As we ate, I found myself studying more closely. There was something odd about Elias that I couldn't quite put my finger on. His clothes, though worn, seemed strangely old-fashioned. The cabin itself contained no modern conveniences, no electricity, no phone, nothing to suggest the 21st century had ever arrived here. "How long have you lived here?" I asked. Elias shrugged. "Long enough. Time moves differently in these parts." After breakfast, he walked me to the door. "Follow the rising sun. About 2 miles east, you'll hit the main trail. Turn north. That's left when you're facing the sun, and keep walking. You'll reach the ranger station before midday." I thanked him profusely, offering once again to pay or to send help back. "No need," he said, smiling for the first time. A small, sad smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just remember what I told you about these woods after dark." The morning was clear, the storm having blown itself out overnight. I followed Elias's directions, moving as quickly as the muddy ground would allow. True to his word, within an hour I found myself on a wide, well-maintained trail that I recognized. Relief washed over me. The ranger was surprised to see me approach in the direction I did. "Sylvan Springs is northeast," he frowned. "How'd you end up coming from the east?" I explained about getting lost, the storm, finding the cabin. The ranger's frown deepened. "Cabin? Ain't no cabins out that way. That's protected wilderness. No structures allowed." "But I stayed there last night," I insisted. "An older man named Elias lives there." The ranger shook his head slowly. "Son, I've worked these woods for 37 years. Know every trail, every clearing, every unofficial campsite. There's no cabin where you're describing." A chill ran through me. "Then where did I stay last night?" The ranger studied me for a long moment. "Maybe you were more turned around than you thought. Easy to happen in a storm." But there was something in his eyes, the same look he'd given me when I'd set out, like he knew more than he was saying. As I was leaving, he called after me, "You said the man's name was Elias?" I nodded. "Elias Sutton disappeared in those woods in 1933. He said quietly. "Ranger back then. Got lost in a storm, they say. Never found a trace. I've done research since then. Elias Sutton was real. He vanished during a search and rescue operation during a severe storm. The person he was looking for was never found either. Sometimes, on rainy nights, I think about that cabin in the woods, about what might have happened if Elias hadn't been there, if I'd opened the door to whatever was knocking. The rain is picking up outside my window now. Can you hear it where you are? That gentle, soothing rhythm on the roof, on the leaves? I used to find it comforting. Not anymore. Now I just wonder if that wasn't Elias in the cabin with me. What was it, and why did it help me? I've never returned to Cherokee National Forest. I don't hike anymore, especially not alone. But sometimes on nights like this when the rain falls heavily, I swear I can hear knocking at my door. And sometimes, just sometimes, I hear a voice that sounds just like Elias, warning me not to answer. Would you answer if you heard knocking on a rainy night like this? I wouldn't. Some doors once opened can never be closed again. And some things once invited in never leave. Listen, is that rain you hear? Or is it knocking? Love these chilling tales around campfire. Now I'm curious, are you still with us? Drop a comment and let us know where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. Are you deep in the woods with just your flashlight and this audio keeping you company? Or maybe curled up safe at home? Or so you think. It's a great way for us to see who's still brave enough to listen until the end. Don't be shy. We want to know where our fearless listeners are listening from. Do you ever wonder what it would be like to be truly alone? Not the kind of alone where you're sitting at home on a quiet evening, but utterly, completely isolated from humanity. I used to romanticize it. Now I know better. The rain's quite heavy tonight, isn't it? I find that soothing normally. The steady drumming against the window panes, washing everything clean, makes this little flat feel like a ship at sea. Safe, protected. I wasn't always afraid of isolation. In fact, I once sought it out. That's how I ended up at Blackstone Lighthouse on that godforsaken stretch of the Northumberland coast. I was running from a broken engagement, a career that had stalled, a life that felt increasingly meaningless. When I saw the advert for a temporary lighthouse keeper's position, 3 months during the autumn storm season, it seemed like Providence. Experience preferred but not essential, it read. Must be comfortable with solitude and adverse weather conditions. Solitude, that's what I wanted. Time to think, to write, to figure out what came next. The lighthouse had been automated years ago, of course, but the historical society that maintained it wanted someone there during the storm season to keep an eye on things, make minor repairs if needed. The modern equipment rarely failed, but when it did, having someone on site could mean the difference between safety and shipwreck. Have you ever been to Northumberland in October? The skies are vast mercurial. The North Sea churns against the rocky shore, gray-green and hungry, beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way. Blackstone sat on a small, rocky island about half a mile offshore, connected to the mainland by a narrow causeway that disappeared completely during high tide. The village nearby, if you could call it that, consisted of perhaps a dozen cottages, a pub that opened sporadically, and a small shop that seemed perpetually on the verge of closing down. My predecessor, a weathered man in his 60s named Malcolm, gave me a cursory tour of the lighthouse and its systems. Main light's automatic, he explained, leading me up the winding staircase to the lantern room. Comes on at sunset, off at sunrise. Backup generator kicks in if the power fails. Your job is mostly to make sure nothing breaks, and if it does, to call the mainland. The lantern room was a marvel of gleaming brass and glass, the massive Fresnel lens at its center catching the afternoon sunlight and fracturing it into rainbows across the whitewashed walls. Beautiful, isn't she? Malcolm said, patting the lens like an old friend. Been guiding ships safely for over 150 years. Has it always been manned? I asked, running my fingers along the cool glass of the windows that encircled the room, offering a 360-degree view of the churning sea below. Malcolm's expression shifted slightly. Mostly had periods where it wasn't. Bad periods. Something in his tone made me glance at him sharply, but he'd already turned away, heading back down the spiral staircase. The living quarters were surprisingly comfortable. A small but functional kitchen, a snug sitting room with fireplace, a bedroom with a narrow but comfortable-looking bed, and a bathroom that had clearly been modernized within the last decade. Power's reliable enough, but keep candles and torches handy. Malcolm advised, storms can get fierce out here. Radio's your lifeline if the phone lines go down. He pointed to an old-fashioned radio set on a desk in the corner. Coast Guard checks in twice daily. Don't miss those calls. As he prepared to leave, I noticed him hesitating by the door, as if debating whether to say something more. Everything all right? I prompted. He studied me for a moment, then sighed. Look, it gets quiet out here. Very quiet. People aren't meant to be alone for too long. The mind starts playing tricks. I smiled reassuringly. I'm looking forward to the quiet, actually. He didn't return the smile. Just, if you start noticing anything strange, anything at all, don't ignore it. Call the mainland. Get someone come out, even if it seems silly. Strange how? I asked, a flicker of unease disturbing my enthusiasm. Malcolm shrugged, suddenly appearing embarrassed. Probably nothing. Old lighthouse keeper's superstition. But this place has history. Before I could press him further, the horn of the boat that would take him back to the mainland sounded. He handed me the keys with a final warning to keep my radio on. And then he was gone. I spent that first afternoon exploring my temporary home. The lighthouse itself was a beautiful structure built in the 1860s of gray stone that had been weathered by a century and a half of salt spray and wind. The tower rose about 30 meters from the rocky ground, a perfect cylinder crowned by the lantern room. Attached to its base was the keeper's house, where I would live. The island was small, perhaps 2 acres in total, mostly bare rock with patches of coarse grass and hardy coastal plants. A stone wall, waist-high, ran around its perimeter, offering minimal protection from the crashing waves during storms. As the sun began to set, I climbed to the lantern room to watch. The sky blazed with color, crimson and gold streaking across the darkening blue. The sea below turned to molten copper. And then, precisely as the sun dipped below the horizon, the light came on, its powerful beams sweeping across the water in a rhythmic pattern. 1, 2, 3, pause. 1, 2, 3, pause. Each lighthouse has its own pattern, its own signature. This would be mine for the next 3 months. I slept surprisingly well that first night, lulled by the distant sound of waves against the rocks below. The bed was comfortable, the blankets warm against the autumn chill that permeated the old stone walls. The next few days passed in a pleasant routine. I'd wake at dawn, make coffee, and walk the circumference of the island as the sun rose. The rest of the morning would be spent checking the lighthouse systems, making small repairs to the keeper's house, and responding to emails via the surprisingly decent satellite internet connection. Afternoons were for reading or writing in my journal. Evenings, I'd cook a simple meal, perhaps have a glass of whiskey, and watch the light come on as darkness fell. At night, I'd often climb to the lantern room and simply watch the beams sweep across the black water, finding comfort in its steady rhythm. The first storm hit at the end of my first week. I woke to the sound of wind howling around the tower, raindrops lashing against the windows like handfuls of gravel. The sky was a uniform gray, the sea beneath it a churning mass of white-capped waves that crashed against the island's edges, sending spray high into the air. It was exhilarating. I spent hours in the lantern room, watching nature's fury unleash itself, feeling the solid stone tower sway almost imperceptibly in the strongest gusts. The rain came down in sheets so thick that at times I couldn't see the mainland, despite it being less than a kilometer away. The storm lasted 3 days. The power flickered occasionally, but never failed completely. The radio crackled with updates from the Coast Guard, checking that I was safe, warning of high seas and extreme weather conditions. When it finally passed, leaving behind a sky of perfect, washed-out blue, I felt a strange sense of achievement, as if I had passed some test of endurance. This was what I'd come for, the raw, elemental experience of nature at its most powerful. It was only after the storm that I began to notice the oddities. The first was the footprints. I was making my morning circuit of the island when I noticed them. A single line of prints in the mud near the eastern edge of the island. They came up from the water's edge, continued for about 10 meters, and then simply stopped. I stared at them, puzzled. They were clearly human, adult-sized. But that was impossible. No one could have landed on the island during the storm. The seas have been much too rough, and I'd have seen any visitors since then. I convinced myself they must be old prints, somehow preserved in the mud despite the rain and wind. Or perhaps my own, though I couldn't recall walking in that particular area. That evening, I found the logbook. I was searching through a cupboard in the sitting room, looking for more candles, when I came across a battered leather volume pushed to the back. It was a keeper's log, dating back to the 1950s. Intrigued, I settled by the fire to read. Most entries were mundane, weather reports, maintenance tasks, occasional notes about passing ships. But as I turned the pages, I began to notice a pattern. Several different keepers, over the span of decades, have recorded the same strange occurrence. Footprints appearing on the island after storms. Footprints that led nowhere. One keeper, a man named Thomas Harrow, who served in the 1970s, had written more extensively about the phenomenon. November 12, 1973. Footprints again today. Same as after the last big blow. Coming up from the East Landing. Stopping dead in the middle of nowhere. Davidson from Society says I'm seeing things. Says the isolation is getting to me. Maybe it is. But I know what I saw. And last night, I heard it again. The knocking. 3 quick raps. Pause. 3 more. Coming from the base of the tower, where there's no door, nothing but solid stone. I didn't go out to look. Some things are better left alone. I closed the book, a chill running down my spine despite the warmth of the fire. Knocking. I hadn't heard any knocking. The footprints could be explained away. Old prints, tricks of light and shadow, my imagination. But knocking, that night I dreamed of drowning. Cold, black water filling my lungs. My limbs leaden as I sank deeper into the abyss. And somewhere above, a light sweeping past. So close, yet impossibly far away. I woke gasping, sheets soaked with sweat. The digital clock on the bedside table read 3:17 a.m. The wind had picked up again, moaning around the tower like a living thing. And then I heard it. Knock, knock, knock. Pause. Knock, knock, knock. For several seconds, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It had come from below, from the direction of the sitting room. Knock, knock, knock. Pause. Knock, knock, knock. Louder this time, more insistent. With shaking hands, I reached for my torch, clicked it on. The beam wavered as I directed it around my small bedroom. Nothing out of place. Nothing unusual. Knock, knock, knock. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, heart hammering in my chest. Hello, I called, immediately feeling foolish. Of course there was no one there. It was just the wind, or perhaps debris being blown against the lighthouse. Silence answered me. Even the wind seemed to have momentarily stilled. I pulled on my dressing gown and torch in hand. crept down the short hallway to the sitting room. The embers of the fire cast a faint, ruddy glow across the room. Nothing moved. Nothing was out of place. I was about to return to bed, already constructing rational explanations for what I'd heard, when something caught my eye. The logbook, which I'd left on the armchair, was now on the floor, lying open. I approached it cautiously, as if it might somehow bite. Bending down, I aimed my torch at the open pages. It had fallen open to an entry I hadn't reached in my earlier reading. December 21st, 1987. Winter solstice. Longest night of the year. He's getting bolder. Knocked at the sitting room door tonight, instead of the tower base. When I didn't answer, he tried the handle. Thank God I'd locked it. I saw his shadow through the gap beneath the door. Not a man's shadow. Something else. Something wrong. The entry was signed by a keeper named Edward Milne. The handwriting was jagged, hurried, as if written by someone in a state of extreme agitation. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, making me jump. The pages of the logbook fluttered, turning on their own in the draft. I slammed it shut and backed away. Just the wind, I told myself firmly. The wind and an overactive imagination stirred up by reading old ghost stories before bed. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat in the armchair, watching the door until dawn lightened the sky outside the windows. Nothing knocked. Nothing tried to handle. In the clear light of morning, I felt rather foolish. Lack of human contact was clearly affecting me more than I'd anticipated. I resolved to make a trip to the mainland that day, to speak with actual people, ground myself in reality again. The walk across the causeway at low tide took about 20 minutes. The village was quiet, most of the cottages seemingly empty, holiday homes, perhaps abandoned now that tourist season was over. The small shop was open, though, an elderly woman knitting behind the counter as I entered. She looked up, surprise registering in her faded blue eyes. "Lighthouse keeper, are you? Thought they'd sent someone out last week." "That's me," I confirmed, selecting a few items from the sparsely stocked shelves. Just needed to resupply. She studied me as she rang up my purchases. "Settling in all right out there, you?" "It's peaceful," I replied, though I had some trouble sleeping last night. Thought I heard knocking. Her hand stilled on the register. Knocking. Something in her tone made me look up sharply. Yes, probably just the wind, though. She was silent for a long moment, then said quietly, "3 knocks, wasn't it?" Pause, and 3 more. My blood ran cold. "How did you know that?" Instead of answering, she reached beneath the counter and pulled out a faded newspaper clipping, which she pushed across to me. "You should know about this, being out there alone." The clipping was yellow with age, the headline still boldly legible. "Tragedy at Blackstone. 3 dead in lighthouse mystery." The article, dated September 1947, described how the lighthouse keeper, his assistant, and a visiting engineer had been found dead under mysterious circumstances. The keeper and assistant were discovered inside the lighthouse, apparently having died of hypothermia. Despite it being a mild September night, the engineer's body was never recovered, but his belongings were found in the keeper's house. Most peculiar, the coroner was quoted as saying, is that both men were soaking wet, as if they'd been immersed in the sea. Yet the lighthouse was locked on the inside, and there was no evidence they had left the building. I looked up from the article, my mouth dry. What does this have to do with knocking? The old woman reclaimed the clipping, folding it carefully before returning it beneath the counter. Before they died, they reported hearing knocking. 3 knocks, pause, 3 more. coming from the base of the tower, where there's no door. That could be a coincidence, I said, not believing it even as I spoke. She shrugged. Perhaps, but others have heard it too, over the years. Always before a storm. Always 3 knocks. I paid for my groceries and left, her words echoing in my head. The sky to the east was darkening ominously as I made my way back across the causeway, hurrying against the incoming tide. That night, another storm rolled in, even fiercer than the first. It shrieked around the lighthouse with almost sentient fury. Waves crashed against the island with such force that spray reached the windows of the lantern room, 80 feet above sea level. I kept the radio on, drawing comfort from the occasional crackle of the Coast Guard's voice checking in. Yes, I was fine. No damage to report. Yes, I would call immediately if that changed. As night deepened, I found myself unable to face the prospect of sleep, of dreams of drowning, of lying alone in the dark listening for knocks that shouldn't exist. Instead, I climbed the winding staircase to the lantern room. The scene that greeted me was both terrifying and magnificent. The beam of the light cut through sheets of rain, momentarily illuminating the heaving seas below before sweeping onward. The wind howled, finding every tiny gap in the old structure, creating an eerie, almost musical moan. I don't know how long I stood there, hypnotized by the storm's raw power. Minutes or hours could have passed. Time seemed suspended in that small, glass-enclosed space between sea and sky. And then I saw it, a figure, standing at the water's edge on the eastern side of the island, a human silhouette, utterly still despite the raging wind and crashing waves that should have knocked it off its feet or drenched it completely. I blinked, certain I was seeing things. When I looked again, the figure was closer, halfway between the water and the lighthouse now. It moved oddly, not walking so much as shifting like a piece of film jumping frames. This isn't real, I told myself. It's a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the sweeping beam, a hallucination brought on by fatigue and isolation. The figure stopped at the base of the tower, directly below the lantern room. Though I couldn't see its face from my vantage point, I had the distinct, skin-crawling sensation that it was looking up at me. Knock, knock, knock. Pause. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was impossibly loud, audible even over the storm, as if it came from within the lantern room itself rather than 80 feet below. I stumbled backward, nearly falling down the spiral staircase in my haste to get away. I slammed the door to the lantern room behind me, though I knew, somehow, that doors and locks would make no difference. Back in the keeper's house, I grabbed the radio, hands shaking so badly I could barely operate the controls. Coast Guard, this is Blackstone Lighthouse, over. I practically shouted. Static answered me, then a voice, breaking up badly. Stone Light, reading you, what's your... There's someone on the island, I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. Or something. I need help. Now. More static then. Repeat, breaking up, storm interference. I was about to try again when the radio died completely. At the same moment, the lights flickered and went out. For a moment, I stood in perfect darkness, the only sound my own ragged breathing and the muffled rage of the storm outside. Then, with a low hum, the emergency backup power kicked in, the lights returning at half strength. Knock, knock, knock. Closer now, from a front door of the keeper's house. I backed away, eyes fixed on the door, until I hit the opposite wall. There was nowhere else to go, nowhere to hide. Just me and whatever, was on the other side of that door. What do you want? I called, my voice breaking. Knock, knock, knock. Please. I whispered, not even sure what I was begging for. The handle of the door began to turn, slowly, deliberately. I watched, paralyzed, as the door swung inward a few inches, then stopped. Nothing entered. Nothing was visible in the gap. And then a voice, not heard with my ears, but somehow inside my head, a voice like water rushing over stones, like the last breath bubbling from drowning lungs. Let me in. I'm so cold. No, I managed to whisper. Let me in. I've been outside so long. The door swung wider, seemingly of its own accord. In the gap, darkness gathered, coalesced, took on a suggestion of form. A man-like shape, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, proportioned subtly but unmistakably inhuman. Water began to pool on the floor, spreading inward from the doorway. Not rain, seawater, carrying with the smell of brine and decay. You're not real, I said, pressing myself against the wall as if I could somehow pass through it. You're not real. A sound came from the figure, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. I was, once, before the storm of 47, before the light went out. Realization dawned, horrible and complete. The engineer, the missing one, the darkness that was its head inclined slightly. Someone has to keep the light. Someone has to guide the ships. The others wouldn't listen, wouldn't let me in. They let the light go out. It took a step forward, water cascading from its form. Where it touched the floor, I could hear a faint sizzling, as if the seawater was unnaturally cold, freezing on contact. I just need warmth, it said, extending an arm toward me. Just a little warmth, a little light, then I can keep the light forever. I looked past it, through the open door. The night beyond was chaos, rain and wind and crashing waves. But somewhere out there was a causeway, the mainland safety. If I could just get past this thing, a sudden, blinding flash lit up the room as lightning struck nearby, followed immediately by a deafening crash of thunder. In that brief, brilliant illumination, I saw the figure clearly for the first time. What had once been a man was now something preserved and transformed by the deep, skin the gray white of a fish's belly, stretched too tight over an elongated frame, eyes huge and black, like those of creatures that dwell in the lightless depths, fingers unnaturally long and webbed. But it was the expression on that terrible face that haunted me most, a look of such intense longing, such desperate hunger, such infinite loneliness that for one mad moment, I almost stepped forward, almost offered whatever comfort I could to this lost, ruined thing. The moment passed. As darkness returned, I lunged to the side, making a break for the door. Cold, impossibly cold fingers brushed my arm as I passed, sending shooting pain through my entire body, as if my blood were turned to ice in my veins. I cried out, stumbled, but kept moving out the door and into the storm. The rain lashed at me, the wind nearly knocking me off my feet. I had no light, no clear sense of direction, only the desperate need to get away, to reach the causeway before the tide made it impassable. Behind me, I heard it calling, that terrible voice cutting through the storm as if from everywhere and nowhere at once. Come back. The tide is rising. You'll drown without the light. I ran blindly, slipping on wet rocks, the roar of the sea growing louder. Was I heading toward the causeway, or away from it, in the darkness and the storm? It was impossible to tell. My foot hit water, not rainwater, but the leading edge of the tide coming in across the causeway. I had minutes, perhaps seconds, before it would be completely submerged. I waded in, the cold water immediately numbing my legs. The current was strong, pulling at me, trying to drag me out to sea. Behind me, I sensed rather than saw movement. The figure, following unhurried, it had no need to rush. If the sea claimed me, I would be as forever. The water was at my waist now, then my chest. Each step was a battle against the current. My limbs were growing numb, unresponsive. This was madness. I wouldn't make it. I should turn back, take my chances with the thing in the lighthouse. Lightning flashed again, and in that moment of illumination, I saw the far end of the causeway, the shore of the mainland. So close, impossibly distant, with the last of my strength, I pushed forward. The water rose to my chin, my mouth, my nose. For a terrible moment, I was completely submerged, my nightmare of drowning becoming reality. Then my feet found purchase on rising ground. I surfaced, gasping, and staggered the last few meters to the shore, collapsing on solid ground as the rain continued to pelt down. When I looked back, I could see the lighthouse in the distance, its beams sweeping steadily through the storm. And there, at the near edge of the causeway, now completely submerged, stood the figure, watching me, waiting. I made my way to the village, half crawling, half stumbling. The lights of the cottages had never looked so welcoming. I pounded on the door of the first one I reached until a startled elderly man opened it. The Coast Guard arrived an hour later. By then, I was wrapped in blankets before a fire, shivering uncontrollably despite the heat. I told them a version of what had happened, that I'd seen someone on the island panic and try to cross the causeway despite the storm and tide. They exchanged glances but asked no questions. Perhaps they'd heard similar stories before. A helicopter was dispatched at first light to check on the lighthouse. They reported that the light was functioning normally, and there was no sign of damage or intrusion, no sign of anyone or anything, other than clear footprints leading from the water's edge to the lighthouse door, and then back again. I never returned to Blackstone. I couldn't face crossing that causeway again, knowing what waited on the other side. The Historical Society found a replacement keeper within a week, a retired fisherman who claimed to have no fear of loneliness or of ghost stories. 2 months later, at the height of another fierce winter storm, Blackstone's light went out. By the time the Coast Guard could reach the island, the fisherman was dead of hypothermia. The coroner said, despite the keeper's house being adequately heated, his body was soaking wet with seawater. They never found anyone to take the keeper's position after that. The lighthouse is fully automated now, maintained by occasional day visits from society members. No one stays overnight. Sometimes, when it rains heavily like tonight, I wake from dreams of drowning to the sound of knocking. 3 quick raps, pause. 3 more, coming from my front door. I never answer. But sometimes I wonder, is it trying to get in, or am I the one being kept out? Is something still keeping that light, guiding ships safely through the storm? And what price is paid for that eternal vigilance? The rain's easing now. But listen, can you hear that? That faint tapping at your window? Probably just a branch, or rain being blown against the glass. Probably. Best not to look, though, just to be safe. Some things are better left unseen, left undisturbed. Some doors should remain unopened. Some lights should be left to those who have already paid the ultimate price to keep them burning. The rain's quite heavy tonight, isn't it? That steady patter against the windows always reminds me of that night 5 years ago. I've never told anyone the full story before. Perhaps it's the rain that makes me want to speak of it now. Or perhaps it's just that enough time has passed that I can finally put it into words. Do you ever take the underground late at night? There's something distinctly unsettling about those tunnels after midnight, when the crowds have thinned and the echoes seem to linger just a bit too long. I used to ride it regularly, the last train home after late shifts at the hospital where I worked as a junior doctor. Back then, exhaustion was my constant companion. My mind often foggy from 20-hour shifts and too little sleep. It was a Friday in November, and I just finished an especially grueling rotation in A&E. The rain had been falling steadily all day, the kind that soaks through everything eventually. By the time I entered Holborn Station at midnight, my coat was drenched, water dripping from my hair onto the worn tile floor. The station was nearly deserted. A lone cleaner pushed a mop across the concourse, and somewhere distant, I could hear the rumble of a train. I swiped my Oyster card and made my way down to the Piccadilly line platform, my footsteps echoing off the curved tunnel walls. Only one other person waited on the platform, a woman in a red coat, standing near the far end, her back to me. I didn't think much of her at the time, just another late-night commuter eager to get home. The digital display indicated the last train. The Cockfosters will arrive in 3 minutes. I leaned against a pillar, eyes heavy with fatigue, listening to the distant sounds of tunnels, the creaks and groans in old systems settling, the soft hum of electricity, the occasional drip of water finding its way in from the rain-soaked streets above. Have you noticed how sounds behave differently underground? How they seem to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. That night, I became aware of another sound gradually rising beneath the usual underground ambience, a soft, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was just water dripping, but it was too regular, too deliberate. Tap, 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 like footsteps, but not quite, more like someone gently knocking on a door, seeking entry. I glanced toward the woman in the red coat, wondering if she heard it too, but she remained motionless, still facing away from me. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from the tunnel itself, from the darkness beyond the platform edge. I took a few steps closer to the yellow safety line, peering into the gloom. The tunnel lights illuminated only the first few meters, beyond which lay impenetrable blackness. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. Faster now, more urgent. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. Something about that sound triggered a primal response in me, the sense that whatever was making it was not something I wanted to encounter. I stepped back from the edge, suddenly very aware of how empty the platform was, how far underground we were, how the last train was still 2 minutes away according to display, that now seemed to be counting down with excruciating slowness. I looked again at the woman in the red coat, suddenly desperate for some human connection, some confirmation that I wasn't alone in this increasingly unsettling situation. "Excuse me," I called, my voice sounding thin and strained even to my own ears. "Do you hear that?" She didn't respond, didn't move. I took a few steps toward her. The tapping sound now, so loud it seemed to reverberate through the entire platform. "Miss, are you all right?" Still no response. I was about 10 feet from her now, close enough to see that her red coat was oddly old-fashioned, with a high collar and large buttons. Her hair, dark and sleek, was pulled back in a style that seemed similarly out of time. The display now showed 1 minute until the train's arrival. I could hear its approach, a distant rumble growing steadily louder, though still not as loud as that incessant tapping. Relief flooded through me. Just 1 more minute, and I'd be safely on the train, away from the strange woman and the unsettling sounds. That's when she turned. I've spent years trying to convince myself that what I saw was a trick of the light, a hallucination born of exhaustion and the strange acoustics of the underground. But I know what I saw. Her face, She had no face. Where features should have been was just smooth, pale skin, interrupted only by what looked like a thin seam where a mouth might be. It wasn't bleeding or horrific in the conventional sense. It was the wrongness of it, the impossible blankness where humanity should be, that made my blood run cold. I stumbled backward. A scream caught in my throat. The woman, if she was a woman, took a step toward me, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. The tapping reached a crescendo, and I realized with dawning horror that it was coming from her, from that seemed the smooth expanse where her mouth should be. It was opening and closing rapidly, like something trying to break through. The rumble of the approaching train grew louder. Lights appeared in the tunnel. Cutting through the darkness, the faceless woman stopped her advance, her head tilting as if listening to the train's approach. Then, with a movement too quick for my eye to follow, she was at the platform edge, her red coat vivid against the darkness of the tunnel. And as the train emerged from the gloom, she stepped off the platform, not in the desperate lunge of someone seeking death, but with the casual confidence of someone stepping through a doorway. I cried out, finally finding my voice, but it was too late. The train rushed past, brakes screeching as the driver must have spotted her too late. I closed my eyes, unable to watch the inevitable impact, but there was no impact. No sound of distress from the train, no emergency stop. When I opened my eyes, the train was pulling up the platform normally, as if nothing had happened. I stood frozen, trying to process what I had just witnessed. Had I imagined it all? Was I so exhausted that I had hallucinated an entire encounter? The train doors opened with their familiar chime. Inside, the carriage was nearly empty. Just a few late-night travelers slumped in seats, most appearing half asleep. Nothing unusual. Nothing to suggest a person had just thrown themselves in front of this very train. Shaking, I entered the carriage, collapsing into the nearest seat. The doors closed, and the train began to move, accelerating into the tunnel. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window, trying to calm my racing heart. That's when I noticed something in the reflection. A splash of red in the seat directly behind me. A red coat. I whipped around, but the seat was empty. When I turned back to the window, the reflection showed only my own pale, frightened face. For the rest of the journey, I sat rigid, afraid to look at the reflections in the windows, afraid of what else I might see. Every tunnel noise, every creak of the train seemed loaded with menace. By the time we reached my stop at Wood Green, I was nearly sick with tension. I all but ran from the station, not caring that the rain was still pouring down, soaking me anew. All I wanted was to be above ground, away from the tunnels and their strange acoustics, away from whatever I had or hadn't seen on that platform. The next day, fighting through a haze of sleep deprivation, I convinced myself it had been nothing more than an exhaustion-induced hallucination. I didn't look at the news, afraid of what I might find. Reports of a suicide on the Piccadilly line, perhaps, or worse. Nothing at all to confirm what I'd experienced. I managed to put aside, to focus on my work, to tell myself it was just a strange episode best forgotten, and I might have succeeded in forgetting, had it not been for what happened a week later. I was on a late shift again, though not quite as late as before. The underground was busier, the Holborn platform populated with enough people that I felt a sense of safety in numbers. The strange incident from the previous week had faded to a disturbing but distant memory. That is, until I noticed a poster on the wall opposite the platform. It was one of those police appeals you sometimes see. Have you seen this person? Above the text was a photograph of a young woman with dark hair pulled back. wearing a red coat with a high collar and large buttons. The exact same coat I'd seen on the faceless woman. The poster stated that Emily Chambers, age 24, had last been seen entering Holborn Station on November 12, 1973, exactly 50 years to the day before my strange encounter. She had never emerged from the station, and despite extensive searches of the tunnels and tracks, no trace of her had ever been found. The poster had apparently been put up as part of a renewed appeal on the anniversary of her disappearance, a cold case that had never been solved. I stood staring at it, my entire body cold with shock. 1973. 50 years ago. It couldn't be a coincidence. The same station, the same distinctive red coat, the exact anniversary. But what did it mean? Had I somehow seen a ghost, or something else entirely? With trembling fingers, I snapped a photo of the poster with my phone, then boarded my train, my mind racing with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. That night, I began researching Emily Chambers' disappearance. There wasn't much information available online, just a few brief mentions and articles about historic unsolved cases on the London Underground. But it was enough to send me to the British Library the next day, searching through newspaper archives from 1973. What I found chilled me to the bone. Emily Chambers wasn't the only one to disappear from Holborn Station. There have been others, not many, and spread out over decades, but enough to form a pattern. All had last been seen waiting for the last train of the night, all on rainy evenings in November. And most disturbing of all, witnesses to some of these disappearances reported hearing a strange tapping sound coming from the tunnels just before the person vanished. The most recent case I could find was from 1997. A young man who'd been captured on CCTV waiting alone on the platform at 12:34 a.m. The CCTV had malfunctioned for exactly 2 minutes, and when the footage resumed, the platform was empty. The last train had not yet arrived, and there was no indication he had left the platform by conventional means. I dug deeper, spending hours in archives and online forums dedicated to London's mysteries. Gradually, a folk tale emerged, whispers of what some called the Midnight Conductor or the Faceless Passenger. According to these stories, every 25 years, on rainy nights in November, something stalked the Piccadilly line platforms at Holborn, seeking lonely travelers waiting for the last train home. Some versions of the tale claimed it was the ghost of a Victorian station master who died in a tunnel collapse. Others suggested it was something that had always lived in the tunnels, far older than the underground itself, awakening periodically to feed. The most unsettling version held that it wasn't a creature or a ghost at all, but a kind of doorway, a tear in reality that appeared in the same spot every quarter century, looking for someone to step through. 25 years. I did the math quickly. 1973, 1997, 2022, the year of my encounter. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't hallucinated or seen a ghost. I had witnessed the beginning of another disappearance, another person taken by whatever haunted those tunnels. And I had very nearly been taken myself. But why hadn't I been? Why had the faceless woman turned away from me, chosen to step in front of the train instead of continuing her approach? The answer came to me with sudden, horrifying clarity as I reread one account from 1997, a maintenance worker who claimed to have heard someone tapping on the walls of a service tunnel near Holborn Lake one night in November. He'd reported following the sound to find a young man with something wrong with his face, standing in the darkness. The worker had fled, and his report had been dismissed as a hoax or a hallucination. The faceless woman hadn't been hunting me. She'd been warning me. The tapping hadn't been threatening. It had been desperate, urgent, trying to communicate. And when the train approached, she hadn't jumped to her death. She'd gone back to wherever she'd come from. The space between stations, perhaps, or some other reality accessible only through the ancient tunnels of the London Underground. This realization should have brought comfort, I suppose, but instead, it left me with more questions. If what I'd seen was Emily Chambers, or what remained of her, what had happened to her in the 50 years since her disappearance? What had taken her face? Her voice? And why try to warn me of a fate she'd already suffered? I've avoided the Piccadilly line since then, particularly Holborn Station. I changed jobs to a hospital close at home, one I could reach by bus or on foot. On the rare occasions I need to use the underground, I make sure to travel during busy hours. Never alone, never the last train. But I can't help wondering about the pattern, the 25-year cycle. The next one would fall in 2047. Will there be another disappearance then? Another lonely traveler who encounters something impossible on a rainy November night? Or will someone heed the warning that I received but didn't understand until it was almost too late? Sometimes on nights like this when the rain falls heavily, I think I hear again that rhythmic tapping like knuckles against glass or bone against stone. Tap, 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 tap. A communication from somewhere just beyond normal perception. A desperate attempt to connect, to warn. Are you listening carefully? Can you hear it now, beneath the sound of the rain? That gentle tapping, trying to tell you something important, something urgent? Perhaps it's just the rain against the window pane. Perhaps it's just my imagination, still haunted by that night 5 years ago. Or perhaps something is trying to warn you, too, about what waits in dark places, about the doors that sometimes open between worlds, about what might come through or what might pull you in. The next time you're alone on an underground platform late at night, and you hear that tapping from the tunnels, don't look toward the sound. Don't step too close to the edge. And whatever you do, don't board a train that arrives with no passengers aboard. Some journeys, once begun, have no return ticket. Are you sure that's just rain you're hearing? Tap, 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 tap. The rain always makes me remember. Do you find that too? How certain sounds can transport you back to moments you'd rather forget. The gentle patter against a window, the rhythmic swish of windscreen wipers. They take me back to that night on the A487. I don't speak of it often. Hardly ever, in fact. Most wouldn't believe me anyway. But there's something about the sound of rain that makes confession feel natural, inevitable even. So if you'll indulge me, I'd like to tell you what happened to me 5 years ago on a stretch of Welsh highway that no longer exists on any map. I was driving back from Cardiff to my home in Aberystwyth. It was late, well past midnight, and the rain was coming down in sheets. Not the gentle drizzle we're hearing now, but a proper deluge that turned the world beyond my headlights into a gray blur. I should have booked a hotel for the night, but I was eager to get home. My mother had been ill, you see, and though she was stable, I hated being away from her for long. The A487 is a tortuous road at the best of times. All blind corners and sudden inclines as it winds through the Welsh countryside. That night, it was treacherous. The rain reduced visibility to almost nothing, and more than once I felt the car hydroplane slightly before the tires found purchase again. But I'd driven that road hundreds of times. I knew every bend, every junction, or so I thought. About an hour into the journey, the rain somehow intensified. It hammered against the roof of my little Vauxhall Corsa with such force that it drowned out the radio. I leaned forward, straining to see through the windscreen. The headlights reflected off the rain, creating a disorienting wall of white that made it almost impossible to discern the road ahead. I should have pulled over, waited it out, but there was nowhere to stop safely on that particular stretch. Just steep embankments on both sides. So I slowed to a crawl and kept going, knuckles white on the steering wheel, shoulders hunched with tension. That's when I noticed it. A subtle shift in the world around me. The rain sound changed, becoming more rhythmic, almost musical. The darkness outside deepened, as if the night itself had somehow thickened. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 2:17 a.m. Then at my phone, no signal. Not unusual for that part of Wales, but still, it added to my growing sense of unease. A sign loomed out of the darkness ahead. I didn't recall there being a junction here, but the rain and fatigue were playing havoc with my sense of direction. The sign was one of those old-fashioned finger posts, the kind you rarely see anymore except in very rural areas. It pointed down a left turn I'd never noticed before. Midnight. It read simply, just that single word, no distance indicated, no further explanation. I drove past, assuming it was the name of some hamlet too small to appear on most maps. Wales is full of such places. Tiny clusters of houses with ancient names that have remained unchanged for centuries. 5 minutes later, I passed another sign, identical to the first. Midnight. It read, pointing left down what appeared to be the same turning I'd passed earlier. A shiver ran down my spine. I'd been driving straight, hadn't doubled back. How could I be passing the same turning again? I kept going, my unease growing into something closer to dread. When the third sign appeared, I was almost expecting it. Midnight, again pointing left. This time, I stopped. The rational part of my brain suggested I was simply overtired, missing turning for other small villages and somehow conflating them in my exhausted mind. But another part, the instinctive animal part that senses danger before it can be seen, urged me to turn around, to head back to Cardiff despite the hour and the weather. As I sat there, engine idling, windscreen wipers beating a hypnotic rhythm, I noticed headlights in my rear view mirror. Another car, coming up fast despite the treacherous conditions. I felt an absurd sense of relief. Another person, another witness to this strange night. The car, a large, dark-colored saloon of a make I couldn't identify, slowed as it approached, then pulled alongside me. The windows were tinted, obscuring the driver, but I sensed him looking at me. Then, with a brief flash of its indicators, the car turned left, down the road to Midnight. I don't know why I followed. Curiosity? A need for company on this unsettling night? Or perhaps something else, a compulsion that wasn't entirely my own. Whatever the reason, I found myself signaling and turning after the dark car, leaving the A487 behind. The road was narrower than I'd expected, barely wide enough for two cars to pass. It wound through dense woodland, the trees pressing close on either side, branches hanging low over the tarmac. My headlights caught their glistening, rain-soaked forms, casting strange, reaching shadows across the road. Despite the poor visibility, the car ahead maintained a steady pace, never quite pulling away, but never allowing me to catch up either. Its red tail lights glowed eerily through the rain, twin beacons leading me deeper into unknown territory. We drove like this for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The woods seemed endless, the road turning back on itself so many times I lost all sense of direction. The rain continued its relentless assault, and the wipers struggled to keep the windscreen clear. Then, abruptly, the woods ended. The road widened slightly, and I found myself entering what appeared to be a small town. The dark car ahead slowed, then turned right and disappeared from view. I stopped at what seemed to be the town's main street, a single thoroughfare lined with buildings that looked oddly out of time. They weren't modern, but neither were they particularly old. They existed in some architectural uncanny valley that made them impossible to date. The street was deserted. Not surprising given the hour and the weather, but there were lights on in some of the buildings, warm yellow glows behind drawn curtains. A pub on the corner had a sign swinging in the wind. The last call. Next to it was what appeared to be a small hotel, the Night Watch Inn. My phone still showed no signal, and the dashboard clock now read 3:33 a.m. I was exhausted, disoriented, and increasingly certain that I'd made a serious mistake in turning off the main road. Yet there was something compelling about this place, something that made me want to stay despite my better judgment. I pulled up outside the hotel. It looked respectable enough. A 3-story building with a small car parked to the side, where a few vehicles were parked, including the dark saloon that had led me here. The rain had eased slightly as I stepped out of my car, but it was still heavy enough that I was drenched by the time I reached the hotel's entrance. A brass bell on the reception desk gleamed in the low light as I rang it. After a moment, the door behind the desk opened and a man emerged. He was tall and unnaturally thin, with pale skin and eyes so dark they appeared almost black in the dimly lit reception area. Despite the hour, he was impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit that looked at least a few decades out of date. "Welcome to midnight," he said, his voice surprisingly warm given his austere appearance. "We've been expecting you." A chill ran through me. Expecting me? I think there must be some mistake. I was just looking for a room for the night. I got caught in the storm. The man smiled, revealing teeth that were just a fraction too white, too perfect. "No mistake. We always have a room ready for travelers who find their way to us on nights like these." He turned the guest book toward me. "If you just sign, please." I hesitated, my hand hovering over the pen he offered. "I don't understand. How could you be expecting me when I didn't even know I'd be coming here myself?" His smile never faltered. "Midnight calls to those who need it, in their own time, in their own way. You turned left 3 times, did you not?" My blood ran cold. How could he possibly know that? "The room is already paid for," he continued smoothly. "Just sign your name and I'll show you up." My instinct screamed at me to leave, to get back in my car and drive. Anywhere, as long as it was away from here. But exhaustion weighed heavily on me, and the thought of continuing my journey in that relentless rain was unbearable. I signed the book, noticing as I did, so that the previous entry was dated 3 years earlier. Room 7. The receptionist said, selecting a key from the row behind him. Top floor and the corridor. The view is particularly fine, especially during storms. He led me up a creaking staircase, down a corridor carpeted in faded red that seemed to stretch impossibly long given the size of the building from outside. The walls were lined with framed photographs, landscapes mostly, but occasionally portraits of solemn-faced individuals who seemed to watch us as we passed. "Here we are," he said at last, stopping before a door with a tarnished brass number 7. He unlocked it and handed me the key. "Breakfast is served whenever you wait. There's no rush here in midnight." He turned to leave, then paused. "One piece of advice, if I may, don't look out the window for too long. The view has a way of drawing people in," with that cryptic warning. He was gone, his footsteps fading much more quickly than seemed possible given the length of the corridor. The room was surprisingly comfortable. A large 4-poster bed with crisp white sheets, antique furniture that gleamed with polish, a bathroom with an old-fashioned clawfoot tub. But it was the window that drew my attention, a large bay window that dominated one wall. Outside, the rain continued to fall, illuminated by a single street lamp directly opposite the hotel. Beyond that, I could just make out the vague shapes of what appeared to be a park or garden, though the darkness and rain obscured most details. I was about to turn away when I noticed a figure standing beneath the street lamp, a woman in a pale dress. seemingly unconcerned by the rain that must have been soaking her. As I watched, she raised her head and looked directly up at my window. Even from that distance, through the rain and darkness, I felt the force of her gaze like a physical thing. My breath fogged the glass, and when it cleared, she was gone. I stumbled back from the window, suddenly acutely aware of the receptionist's warning. Had I imagined her? Was my exhausted mind playing tricks? Too tired to make sense of it, I stripped to my underwear and collapsed into bed. Despite my unease, sleep claimed me almost instantly, but my dreams were troubled. Fragmented visions of endless roads, of rain that whispered my name, of pale figures watching from the trees. I woke to silence. The rain had stopped, and sunlight streamed through a gap in the heavy curtains I didn't remember closing. For a blissful moment, I forgot where I was. Then it all came rushing back. The strange signs, the dark car, midnight. My watch read 10:47 a.m. I'd slept far longer than intended. My mother would be worried. I'd promised to call when I got home. I dressed quickly and headed downstairs, hoping to find a phone I could use since my mobile still showed no signal. The reception area was deserted. The guest book no longer on the desk. From somewhere deep in the building, I heard the faint sounds of conversation and the clink of cutlery on plates. Following the sounds, I found myself in a small dining room where a few other guests were having breakfast. They looked up briefly as I entered, then returned to their meals or newspapers. There was something odd about them, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Their clothes, perhaps, all slightly out of date, as if from different eras. Or maybe it was their stillness, the deliberate way they moved, as if conserving energy. A waitress appeared at my elbow, a young woman with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her uniform as anachronistic as everything else in this place. "Coffee?" she asked. I nodded, too disconcerted to speak. As she poured, I noticed her hands, pale and slender, but with nails that seemed slightly too long, slightly too pointed. "Do you have a phone I could use?" I asked when she'd finished pouring. "My mobile has no signal." She smiled, the expression not quite reaching her eyes. "No phones at midnight. No need for them here. But I need to call my mother," I insisted. "She'll be worried." I was supposed to be home. Something like pity flickered across the waitress's face. Time works differently in midnight. Don't worry about outside concerns just yet. Enjoy your breakfast first. She walked away before I could question her further. I looked down at the plate she placed before me. Eggs, bacon, toast. All perfectly normal, yet somehow unappetizing. I pushed it aside and instead sipped the coffee, which was surprisingly good, rich and strong. As I drank, I studied my fellow guests more carefully. A man in what looked like 1940s attire read a newspaper whose headlines I couldn't quite make out. An elderly couple dressed in clothes from perhaps the 1970s ate in silence, not looking at each other. And at a corner table, a young woman in a pale dress sat alone, staring out the window at the now sunny street. With a jolt, I recognized her, the woman I'd seen in the rain last night. In daylight, I could see she was beautiful in a haunting, ethereal way. Her skin was porcelain pale, her hair a dark curtain that fell past her shoulders. She turned suddenly, as if sensing my scrutiny, and our eyes met. Her gaze held mine for a long moment. Then she smiled, a small, sad expression, and rose from her table. She moved with unusual grace as she approached me. "You're new," she said, her voice soft yet somehow carrying clearly despite the murmur of conversation around us. "Just arrived last night?" I nodded. "I got caught in the storm, took a wrong turning." "There are no wrong turnings to midnight," she replied. "Only destined ones. May I?" She gestured to the empty chair opposite me. I nodded again, and she sat, arranging her pale dress, which I now saw was an old-fashioned nightgown rather than a proper dress. With careful precision, "My name is Eleanor," she said. "I've been in Midnight for quite some time." "I'm David," I replied, "and I don't intend to stay long. I just need to find my way back to the main road." Eleanor's smile faltered. "It's not quite that simple. Midnight doesn't appear on any map, and it can't be reached by conventional means. Those who find their way here do so, because midnight calls to them." That's what the receptionist said. I muttered, "But it doesn't make sense. Places don't call to people, don't they?" Eleanor tilted her head slightly. "Haven't you ever felt drawn to a particular location? A sense of belonging, or perhaps its opposite, a profound unease that nevertheless compels you to stay?" I thought of my childhood home, of the inexplicable comfort its familiar walls had always provided. And I thought of other places, a certain cliff path near Aberystwyth where I'd always felt watched, an abandoned quarry I discovered as a teenager that had both terrified and fascinated me. Midnight exists in the spaces between. Eleanor continued. "It's a waypoint for those who are transitioning." "Transitioning to what?" I asked, a sense of dread building in my stomach. Eleanor looked away. "That depends on the person. For some, it's a place of rest before continuing their journey. For others, it's a final destination." "You're talking as if this place isn't real," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Oh, it's real," she assured me. "As real as anything. Just not fixed, not permanent, not for everyone." I stood abruptly. "I need to leave. Now, can you tell me how to get back to the A487? Eleanor's expression grew troubled. "You can't leave yet. You haven't completed your transition." "I'm not transitioning anywhere," I insisted. "I just took a wrong turn in the rain. This is a real place. Those are real people." I gestured around the dining room. "And there must be a real road that leads back to the highway." Eleanor sighed. "Walk with me? I can explain better outside." Against my better judgment, I agreed. We left the hotel together, stepping out into bright sunshine that seemed at odds with the previous night's torrential rain. The street looked different in daylight, quainter, almost picturesque, yet still with that quality of being unstuck in time. "Midnight has existed for centuries," Eleanor said as we walked. "It appears to those who need it. Travelers lost in storms, souls at crossroads, people running from something they can't escape. Time moves differently here. A night in midnight might be minutes in the outside world, or it might be years." "That's impossible," I protested. Eleanor smiled sadly. "Many things that seem impossible simply operate by rules we don't understand." We'd reached what appeared to be the edge of the town, a small park with a pond at its center. Eleanor led me to a bench overlooking the water. "Why do you think you were drawn here, David?" she asked gently. "I wasn't drawn here," I insisted. "I followed another car." "The dark saloon," she nodded. "Did you see the driver?" I frowned, realizing I hadn't. The windows were tinted. "And yet you followed it down an unknown road in the middle of the night in a storm." Her voice was kind but firm. "That's not like you, is it? You're usually so cautious, so responsible." I stared at her. "How would you know what I'm usually like?" Instead of answering, she asked, "Why were you driving so late, in such dangerous conditions?" "I told you I was trying to get home. My mother's been ill." "Yes," Eleanor said softly. "Your mother? Tell me about her." "She has had cancer," I said, the words catching my throat. "But the treatment was working. She was getting better." Eleanor took my hand in hers. Her skin was cool, almost cold. "David," she said gently, "I want you to think very carefully about the last time you saw your mother." I pulled my hand away. "What are you talking about?" It was before I left for Cardiff. She was tired from the chemo, but she was okay. She told me to drive carefully. And you did. Eleanor nodded. You always do. But the storm that night. Memory flashed like lightning. Rain lashing against the windscreen, visibility near zero. A curve in the road coming up faster than expected. My hands wrenching the steering wheel. The sickening sensation of the car hydroplaning, the world spinning, the impact. Then darkness. No, I whispered, my voice breaking. No, that's not right. I'm here. I'm fine. You're in midnight, Eleanor said softly. And midnight is a place between places. Between life and death, you mean, I said bitterly, the truth washing over me in a cold wave. Am I dead, then? Is this some kind of purgatory? Eleanor shook her head. Not purgatory. Think of it more as a waiting room, a place to process, to come to terms, to decide. Decide what? Whether to move on or go back. Hope flared briefly. I can go back to my life. Sometimes, Eleanor said, her eyes full of an ancient sadness. But there's always a cost. And the longer you stay in midnight, the harder it is to leave. I thought of the other guests at the hotel. People from different times, different eras. Had they all been like me once? Lost travelers who never found their way home? How long have you been here? I asked Eleanor. Since 1967, she replied. I was on my way to my wedding when our car went off the road in a storm. Similar to your accident. Actually, that's often how it happens. Moment of transition, of change, make the veil between worlds thinner. And you chose to stay? In midnight, she looked away, across the still water of the pond. I never made a conscious choice. I just didn't leave when I could have. I was afraid of what waited beyond. And now I'm part of this place. The woman in the rain, I murmured, watching from beneath the street lamp. She nodded. I try to help the new arrivals. Some understand quickly, others take time. A few never accept the truth. Like the man reading the newspaper, the couple having breakfast. They've been here longer than I have, Eleanor said. They're almost part of the architecture now. I thought of my mother, waiting for a son who would never come home. The pain of it was almost unbearable. How do I leave? I asked, how do I go back? Eleanor's expression was grave. You have to find the road you came in on. But David, you need to understand, going back doesn't mean everything will be as it was. Your body in the other world is badly injured. Recovery would be long, painful, uncertain. But my mother might have already mourned you, she finished gently. Time works differently here, remember? It's been 3 days in the outside world since your accident. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. 3 days. My mother will be frantic, devastated. I need to try, I said firmly. Can you help me? Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. I can show you the way. But only you can decide whether to take it. She led me back to the town, which now seemed to shift and change around us. Buildings rearranging themselves in ways that should have been impossible, yet somehow didn't surprise me anymore. We walked in silence, each lost in our own thoughts, at what I presumed was the edge of town. The buildings abruptly gave way to the dense woodland I'd driven through the previous night. A narrow road, little more than a dirt track now, wound its way between the trees. This is as far as I can go, Eleanor said, stopping at the tree lean. The road will take you back to the moment of your accident. What happens then depends on your will to live, and perhaps a bit of luck. I turned to her. Why are you helping me? Why not convince me to stay like you did? A single tear slid down her pale cheek. Because no one helped me. And because your mother is still alive, still waiting. My fiancé died in our crash. I had nothing to go back to, even if I'd understood in time. On impulse, I hugged her, this strange, sad woman from another time. Her body felt insubstantial in my arms, as if she were indeed becoming part of midnight itself, fading into its fabric. "Thank you," I whispered. She stepped back, composed herself. "Don't thank me yet. The journey won't be easy. And David," her eyes held mine, "if you make it back, live well, for both of us." With that, she turned and walked back toward the town. I watched until she disappeared around a corner, then faced a dark path ahead. The walk through the woods seemed to take both moments and eternities. The trees pressed close, their branches creating a canopy that blocked out the sunlight. Occasionally, I heard whispers, voices just at the edge of comprehension, calling me back to midnight, offering rest, peace, an end to struggle. I pressed on, focusing on the image of my mother's face, on her voice saying, "Drive carefully," as I'd left for Cardiff. The path grew steeper, the air colder. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. At times, I thought I glimpsed figures among the trees, pale shapes watching my progress with hungry eyes. When I emerged from the woods, it was night again. Rain lashed down, exactly as it had on the night of my accident. Ahead, the A487 stretched into darkness, and there was my car, headlights cutting through the rain, approaching the curve that I now knew would be my undoing. Time seemed to slow as I watched my own past unfold before me. The car hit the curve too fast, began to slide. I could see myself inside, fighting the wheel, panic clear on my face even through the rain-streaked windows. I knew what came next. The skid, the drop off the embankment, the rolling impact that had sent me to midnight. Without conscious thought, I ran onto the road, waving my arms, trying to warn myself. My past self swerved to avoid the sudden apparition on the road with me, and in doing so, changed the angle of approach to the curve. The car still skidded, still left the road, but instead of rolling, it slid down the embankment and came to rest against a tree, damaged but not destroyed. Pain exploded through my body, ribs cracking, leg breaking, head hitting the steering wheel. The world spun, darkness closing in from all sides. But through the shattered windscreen, I saw a road sign illuminated briefly by the failing headlights. A487 Aberystwyth with 15 miles. Not the road to midnight. The road home. I woke in hospital 3 days later. Broken ribs, broken leg. Severe concussion. The doctors called it a miracle I'd survived it all. A passing motorist had found the wreck the morning after the crash. Called an ambulance. My mother was there when I woke up, pale and drawn from worry, but very much alive. When I was well enough, she told me that the doctors had been concerned about brain damage. I'd been mumbling about a place called Midnight. I never told her the full story. How could I? But I did research Eleanor's accident once I was discharged. It took some digging through old newspaper archives, but I found it eventually. A small article from September 1967 about a young woman killed when her car went off the road during a storm. She'd been on her way to her wedding. Her fiancé had died in the same crash. The article included a photograph. Even in the grainy black and white image, I recognized her immediately. Eleanor, exactly as she'd appeared to me in Midnight. 5 years have passed since then. I recovered fully, moved back to Aberystwyth to be near my mother. Her cancer went into remission, though we know it might return someday. I cherish every moment with her. Living well as Eleanor asked me to, I've never seen a sign for midnight again. Never felt that strange compulsion to turn left 3 times. But sometimes, when it rains heavily like tonight, I think I catch a glimpse of her, a pale figure standing beneath a street lamp, watching over those who might accidentally find their way to that place between places. And I wonder about the others there, the man with his newspaper, the silent couple at breakfast, the receptionist with his too perfect smile. Are they still waiting for something? Or have they, like Eleanor, become permanent residents of that impossible town? The rain's easing now. It always does, eventually. But listen, can you hear that sound beneath the patter on the roof? Like knocking, almost. 3 quick taps. A pause, then 3 more. Probably just a branch against the window. Probably. But I never look outside when it rains at night, just in case there's a dark car waiting, its driver invisible behind tinted windows, ready to lead another lost soul down the road to midnight. The rain seems particularly heavy tonight, doesn't it? That persistent drumming against the roof tiles, the occasional gurgle of the gutters overflowing. It's almost like whispers, if you listen carefully enough. Voices just on the edge of comprehension. I've always found such nights both comforting and unsettling. Comforting in their cocoon of sound that wraps around the house, isolating you from the outside world. Unsettling for precisely the same reason. On nights like these, you're truly alone with whatever shares your space. Have you ever had that sensation of being watched when you're certain you're alone? That prickling awareness that raises the fine hairs on the back of your neck? I never had, not really, until I moved into the old Victorian on Blackwood Lane. It wasn't my first choice of residence. The house had been in my late grandmother's family for generations, and I inherited it somewhat reluctantly after her passing last year. I'd only visited a handful of times as a child, hazy memories of high ceilings, creaking floorboards, and a peculiar musty scent that seems unique to homes of a certain age. My plan had been to sell it, of course. A property that size and that location would fetch a tidy sum, even accounting for the renovations it desperately needed. But the solicitor handling my grandmother's estate advised me to spend some time there first, to properly catalog the contents, many of which were valuable antiques in their own right. Take your time, he'd said with an odd emphasis. Get to know the place before making any decisions. At the time, I'd attributed his insistence to a concern for my emotional well-being, assuming he thought I needed time to process my grandmother's passing. Now, I'm not so sure. The house revealed itself to me gradually over those first few weeks. Each room had its own personality, its own subtle energy. The kitchen, with its huge Aga cooker and worn stone floor, felt welcoming despite its dated fixtures. The drawing room was formal, almost austere, filled with furniture too delicate to actually use. The library, my favorite room, was a haven of leather-bound books and a lingering scent of pipe tobacco that no amount of airing seemed to dispel. But it was the attic that called me most insistently, though I couldn't have explained why. It wasn't until the 3rd week, on a rainy night not unlike this one, that I finally ventured up there. The narrow stairs creaked alarmingly beneath my weight, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence of the sleeping house. The door at the top was heavy oak, secured with a tarnished brass lock that yielded reluctantly to the antique key I found in my grandmother's desk. The attic itself was extensive, running the entire length of the house, with dormer windows at regular intervals allowing moonlight to create islands of dim illumination in the otherwise pitch-black space. The air was thick with dust and the peculiar stillness that accumulates in long undisturbed places. I swept my torch beam across stacked trunks, shrouded furniture, and precariously balanced boxes, the accumulated detritus of a family's history. Most of it was unremarkable. Old clothes, Christmas decorations, photograph albums, the usual forgotten treasures and outdated necessities that find their way to such spaces. I was about to retreat back downstairs when my torch caught something that gleamed in the furthest corner. Something tall and covered with a heavy velvet cloth that had once been crimson, but had faded to the color of dried blood. Curiosity drew me forward. The floorboards protested beneath my feet as I picked my way between the stacked possessions of my ancestors. When I reached the shrouded object, I hesitated, An inexplicable reluctance staying my hand momentarily. Don't be ridiculous, I chided myself. It's just more old furniture. I grasped the velvet cover and pulled it away in one swift motion. Dust billowed, dancing in the beam of my torch, temporarily obscuring my view. As it settled, I found myself staring at a mirror, but not just any mirror. This was an antique pier glass, nearly 7 feet tall, with an ornate frame of dark wood carved into elaborate shapes. Vines and leaves, yes, but also faces, dozens of them, peering out from between the foliage. Some appeared serene, others twisted in expressions that might have been ecstasy or agony. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, each face detailed down to the finest features, each leaf veined with exquisite precision. The glass itself was cloudy with age, its silvering mottled and dark in places, giving it a peculiar depth. Standing before it, I could see only the vaguest outline of my reflection, more suggestion than image. Something about it captivated me. Despite its somewhat macabre ornamentation, it was a beautiful piece, undoubtedly valuable and I suspected quite old. Why had it been hidden away up here rather than displayed prominently downstairs? I checked my watch and was startled to find it was nearly midnight. I'd been in the attic far longer than I'd realized. With a last glance at the mirror, I replaced its velvet shroud and made my way back to the stairs. That night, I dreamed of faces watching me from behind leaves, their expressions shifting when I wasn't looking directly at them. I woke several times, each instance coinciding with particularly heavy bursts of rain against the windows, my heart racing for reasons I couldn't articulate. The next morning, I called the solicitor. "The mirror in the attic," I said without preamble when he answered, "the one with the faces carved into frame. What can you tell me about it?" A long silence followed, long enough that I checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "Mr. Harrington?" I prompted. "I was hoping you would find that." He said finally, his voice tight, "Your grandmother was quite specific in her instructions that it should remain covered." "Why? It's beautiful. Valuable, too, I'd imagine." He sighed heavily. "It's been in your family for generations. Brought back from Italy by your great-great-grandfather in the 1850s. There are stories about it." "What kind of stories?" I asked, a chill running down my spine despite the warm morning sunshine streak. "The sort that sensible people don't put much stock in," he replied carefully. "But your grandmother took them seriously enough. She refused to have it in the main house after your grandfather died, had it moved to the attic the very next day." "What happened to my grandfather?" I asked. I'd never met him. He died before I was born. Heart attack, I'd always been told. Another pause. "Perhaps we should discuss this in person, Miss Reynolds. I can come by this afternoon if that's convenient." I agreed, though his reticence only fueled my curiosity. After hanging up, I found myself drawn back to the attic, back to the mirror. This time, I examined it more closely, running my fingers over the intricate carvings, noting how some of the faces seemed to follow my movements, an optical illusion created by their positioning among the leaves. The glass remained stubbornly opaque, reflecting little more than shadows and suggestions of form. On impulse, I decided to bring it downstairs. It was heavy, but not unmanageably so. I managed to navigate the narrow attic stairs without incident, and chose to place it in the library, where the dark would complement the existing decor. Once positioned against the wall, the mirror transformed the room. It had presence, drawing the eye immediately upon entering. I found myself standing before it, trying to make out my reflection in its clouded surface. For just a moment, I thought I saw something, not my own image, but something deeper within the glass, a movement like ripples across water. I blinked and it was gone. Just an old, mottled mirror again, offering only the vaguest silhouette of whoever stood before it. Mr. Harrington arrived promptly at 3, his expression souring immediately when he entered the library and saw the mirror in pride of place. "You moved it," he said flatly. "It seemed a waste to leave it gathering dust in the attic," I replied. "It's a remarkable piece." He approached it cautiously, maintaining a distance that struck me as oddly deliberate. "Did your grandmother ever speak to you about this mirror?" I shook my head. We weren't particularly close. She was rather remote as I remember her. "She wasn't always," he said quietly. "The Elizabeth Reynolds I first met 40 years ago was vivacious, full of life. That changed after your grandfather died." "What happened to him?" I asked again. "Really?" Mr. Harrington's gaze remained fixed on the mirror. "The official cause was heart failure, but he was found here, in this room, in front of this very mirror. His expression..." He trailed off, shaking his head slightly. "The housekeeper who found him said she'd never seen such terror on a human face." A chill ran through me despite the warmth of the day. "You're saying the mirror had something to do with his death?" He turned to me finally. "I'm saying that's what your grandmother believed. She said the mirror had been woken up. Those were her exact words. She insisted it be covered and moved to the attic immediately." "Woken up," I repeated skeptically. "What does that even mean?" "According to family lore, the mirror was created by a Venetian craftsman in the early 16th century. He was said to be a practitioner of certain esoteric arts. The faces carved into frame aren't decorative. They're meant to be containment vessels." "Containment for what?" Mr. Harrington's lips pressed into a thin line. "Spirits, souls, entities trapped by the craftsman through means best not discussed. The mirror was designed as a prison of sorts." I couldn't help but laugh. "You can't seriously believe that." "What I believe is irrelevant," he replied stiffly. "But I respected your grandmother immensely, and she believed it with absolute conviction. She made me promise that if you ever found a mirror, I would tell you its history, and her wishes that it remain covered and isolated." "Well, you fulfilled your promise," I said, trying to keep the amusement from my voice. "But the mirror stays where it is. It's a beautiful piece of art, regardless of the superstitions attached to it." He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded resignedly. "Very well. I've done what I can. But Miss Reynolds, if you experience anything unusual, anything at all, please don't hesitate to call me, day or night." After he left, I stood before the mirror again, studying its clouded surface. Spirits trapped in a mirror? It was absurd medieval thinking. The kind of story invented to explain the random tragedies of life in an age before modern medicine could identify heart disease or aneurysms. Yet as the day progressed, I found myself repeatedly drawn back to the library, to the mirror. Each time, I thought I glimpsed something just beyond the clouded glass. Movements, shapes, suggestion of faces pressing forward before retreating into the depths. That night, the rain returned, pattering against the windows in an irregular rhythm that almost resembled whispers. I sat in the library with a glass of wine, the only illumination coming from the fire in the grate and a single table lamp. The mirror loomed in the shadows, its carved faces seeming to shift and change in the flickering firelight. I don't know how long I sat there, watching it, waiting for something. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I jerked awake suddenly, disoriented and chilled despite the fire. The room felt different. The air had thickened somehow, charged with strange energy that made the fine hairs on my arms stand on end. The rain had intensified, drumming against the house with almost deliberate force. And the mirror had changed. The clouded glass now seemed to swirl with a faint luminescence, like moonlight through fog. The carved faces were more defined, more present, their expressions more animated. And as I watched, frozen in my chair, the surface of the glass rippled like disturbed water. A hand pressed against it from within. A pale, slender hand with long fingers that splayed across the glass as if testing its resistance. It was followed by another, then the suggestion of a face pressing forward. Features indistinct but unmistakably human. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. This wasn't possible. It was a hallucination, a dream, the wine combined with the late hour and Mr. Harrington's ridiculous stories. The glass bulged outward, stretching like a membrane as whatever was behind it pushed against the barrier. The carved faces in the frame began to whisper, a sound almost indistinguishable from the rain, but undeniably coming from the mirror itself. Dozens of voices, overlapping, urgent, some pleading, others threatening. Let us through, they seemed to say. Let us out. Let us in. I finally found my voice, my limbs. I stumbled to my feet, back and away from the mirror even as the glass continued to distort, the hands pressing more insistently, the face becoming clearer, a woman's face, beautiful but terrible, her mouth open in what might have been a silent scream or a hungry grin. My back hit the doorframe. Without taking my eyes off the mirror, I fumbled for the light switch, desperate to dispel the shadows, to impose rational electric light on this impossible scene. The overhead chandelier blazed alight. In an instant, the mirror was just a mirror again, old, clouded, reflecting nothing but vague shadows. The carved faces were just that, carvings intricate but inanimate. I stood trembling in the doorway, my heart pounding painfully against my ribs. Had I dreamed it? Hallucinated? Was I losing my mind? I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in the kitchen, as far from the library as possible, lights blazing in every room, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house as it settled around me. The rain continued unabated, its persistent rhythm now seeming malevolent, deliberate, a signal I couldn't quite decipher. In the cold light of morning, with sunshine replacing the rain and birds singing in the garden, I felt foolish. Of course it had been a dream, my imagination inflamed by Mr. Harrington's Gothic tales. The mirror was just an antique, valuable but inanimate, yet I couldn't bring myself to enter the library. I spent the day in other parts of the house, cataloging items in the drawing room and bedrooms, researching values online, making calls to auction houses. But as evening approached again, bringing with it heavy clouds and the promise of more rain, my apprehension grew. I should cover it again, I thought, or better yet, move it back to the attic. There was no rational reason for my unease, but I couldn't shake the memory of those hands pressing against the glass, the face trying to push through. By the time I finally gathered my courage to enter the library, night had fallen completely. Rain pattered against the windows, lighter than the previous night, but steady. I flipped on every light, dispelling all shadows, and approached the mirror cautiously. It looked exactly as it had when I first brought it down. Ornate, beautiful, slightly sinister with its carved faces watching from among the wooden leaves. The glass was clouded, mottled with age, reflecting only the vaguest outline of the room behind me. I reached out a tentative hand to touch the frame, tracing one of the carved faces with my fingertip. The wood was cool, slightly rough with age, completely ordinary. This is ridiculous, I said aloud, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet room. It's just an old mirror. As if in response, the lights flickered, once, twice, then stabilized. I froze, fingers still touching the carved face, heart suddenly racing again. Just the storm, I muttered, but I withdrew my hand quickly. That night, I made sure to close the library door before retiring to bed, though I left the lights on inside. I took a mild sleeping pill, determined to get some rest and break the cycle of superstitious fear that had gripped me. The medication worked. I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep almost immediately. When I woke, pale morning light was filtering through the curtains, The storm had passed, and for the first time since finding the mirror, I felt completely at ease. Until I went downstairs and found the library door standing open. I was certain I'd closed it the night before. Absolutely certain. Yet here it was, wide open, revealing the brightly lit room beyond. And the mirror had moved not far, just a few inches away from the wall, angled slightly differently than it had been the day before. I stood in the doorway, unable to step across the threshold, cold sweat breaking out across my skin. I hadn't moved it. I knew I hadn't, which meant, no, there had to be a rational explanation. The house was old, the floors uneven. Perhaps it had shifted on its own, just the natural settling of the building. But I couldn't convince myself. Something had moved that mirror in the night. While I slept, something had opened that door. I called Mr. Harrington with shaking hands. "The mirror," I said when he answered. "It moved on its own, and there were things inside it last night." His sharp intake of breath was audible even through the phone. "Don't touch it," he said urgently. "Don't even go near it. I'm coming over. And Miss Reynolds, don't look into it. Whatever you do, don't make eye contact with your reflection." He arrived within the hour, bringing with him a heavy canvas bag. His face was grim as I led him to the library, keeping my distance from the mirror. "It's woken up fully now," he said quietly, staring at the mirror with a mixture of fear and resignation. "Your grandmother warned me this might happen if it was ever brought down from the attic." "What exactly is happening?" I demanded. "What is that thing?" "I told you it's a prison. Or it was." He began removing items from his bag. White candles, a small bottle of what looked like oil, a length of red cord. The craftsman who made it trapped something inside, something that wants out. "This is insane," I said, but without conviction. After what I'd seen, I was prepared to believe almost anything. "Your great-great-grandfather acquired it in Venice, not understanding what it was. Just an exotic curiosity to him. For generations, it remained dormant. But sometimes certain people can activate it. Your grandfather was one such person. And now it seems, so are you." He placed the candles at specific points around the mirror, lit them with methodical precision. "Your grandmother learned how to contain it after your grandfather's death. She sought out experts in such matters, learned the necessary rituals." "Rituals?" I echoed faintly. "You mean like exorcism?" "Something like that." He uncorked the bottle of oil and began tracing symbols on the floor around the mirror. "This won't banish what's inside. Nothing can, short of destroying the mirror completely, which brings its own risks. But it will put it back to sleep, contain again." I watched him work, tore between skepticism and the undeniable evidence of my own experience. The rational part of my mind insisted this was all nonsense, medieval superstition. But another part, more primal, more instinctive, whispered that Mr. Harrington was right, that something ancient and malevolent lived within that clouded glass, something that had reached for me in the darkness. "Why me?" I asked suddenly. Why did it wait for my grandfather and now for me? Mr. Harrington paused his work, glancing up at me. "Certain bloodlines are more susceptible to such things, more visible to entities from elsewhere. Your family line has always had a particular sensitivity, according to your grandmother." He resumed his preparations, now wrapping the red cord around the frame in a complex pattern, weaving it between the carved faces. "Almost done," he murmured. "Just the final binding, and then..." The lights went out, not just in the library, but throughout the house. A sudden, complete darkness broken only by the faint glow of the candles around the mirror. The flames bent as if in a strong breeze, though the air in the room was completely still. "No," Mr. Harrington whispered. "No, it's too soon. I haven't finished binding." The candles guttered, then flared unnaturally high, casting grotesque shadows across the walls. The temperature in the room plummeted. I could see my breath clouding in the sudden cold. And the mirror began to glow from within, a pale, sickly light that grew steadily brighter. The carved faces twisted, no longer wooden but somehow alive, their mouths opening in silent screams or laughter. The glass surface rippled, bulged, hands pressed against it. Not one or two as I'd seen before, but dozens, a mass of pale limbs pushing, clawing, seeking exit. Faces crowded behind them, distorted by the pressure against the glass, their features twisted in hunger and desperation. "The cord," Mr. Harrington gasped. "Help me finish the binding." But I couldn't move. I was transfixed by the spectacle of the mirror, by the entities within it struggling for release. Among the pressing hands and faces, one stood out, a woman with long dark hair and eyes that seemed to fix directly on mine. Her mouth curved in a knowing smile. She reached forward, her hand pressing against the barrier between us. Fingers splayed, and suddenly I felt a compulsion to approach, to place my own hand against hers. It was overwhelming, irresistible. I took a step forward. "Miss Reynolds." Mr. Harrington's voice seemed to come from very far away. Don't touch the glass." Another step. The woman's smile widened, revealing teeth too sharp, too numerous. Her eyes, I now saw, were not eyes at all but empty sockets, bottomless and hungry. Not a woman. Never a woman. Something ancient pretending a humanity, wearing a face like a mask. I was directly before the mirror now, my own reflection nowhere to be seen, only the pressing crowd of entities within the glass. The not woman's hand still reached for mine, her palm flattened against a glass that now seemed as thin and permeable as tissue. "My grandfather," I whispered. "Did he touch the glass?" The thing smiled wider, impossibly wide, its jaw unhinging like a snake's. Behind me, I heard Mr. Harrington cry out in warning or despair. I raised my hand, holding it just inches from the surface of the mirror. The entity on the other side trembled with anticipation, with hunger. I could feel its desire to be free, to cross over, to take what it wanted from this world. "What did you do to him?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. No answer, just that terrible smile, those empty eyes fixed on mine. But I knew, somehow, I knew exactly what had happened to my grandfather. What would happen to me if I touched that glass? In one swift motion, I reached not for the mirror, but for the nearest candle. I grasped it, feeling the hot wax burn my fingers, and hurled it directly at the glass. The surface shattered with a sound like 1,000 screams. Instantly, the pressure within seemed to release, not outward into our world, but inward, as if whatever lay beyond the mirror was pulling its inhabitants back, reclaiming them. The not-woman smile twisted into a snarl of rage as she was yanked backward into darkness. Wind howled to the library, though no window was open. A vortex centered on the broken mirror, pulling at my clothes, my hair, trying to drag me toward the fractured glass. Mr. Harrington grabbed my arm, hauling me backward toward the door. "Run!" he shouted over the maelstrom. "It can't be contained now." We fled the library, slamming the door behind us. Even through the solid oak, we could hear the chaos within, furniture overturning, glass shattering. And beneath it all, a chorus of voices, some howling in rage, others weeping, still others laughing with terrible glee. We didn't stop running until we were outside the house, standing in the gravel driveway in the gray morning light. Behind us, the windows of the library blazed with unnatural light, then went dark one by one, like candles being extinguished. Silence fell heavy and complete. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice a hoarse whisper. Mr. Harrington shook his head. "I don't know. Breaking the mirror, it's never been done before. The prison is destroyed, but what that means for what was inside. He trailed off, staring at the now quiet house. We waited an hour before venturing back inside, moving cautiously through the hallway toward the library. The door remained firmly shut. When Mr. Harrington finally gathered the courage to open it, we found nothing. Not nothing in the sense of an empty room. Nothing at all. Where the library had been was simply an empty space, as if that part of the house had never existed. No walls, no floor, no ceiling. Just a void, a perfect absence that our minds couldn't quite process, our eyes sliding away from it as if refusing to acknowledge its existence. I sold the house within the week, accepting the first offer without negotiation. I didn't tell the new owners about the missing room, about the mirror, about what had happened. I couldn't have explained it even if I'd tried. In the sale documents, the library was simply listed as uninhabitable due to structural damage. I moved to a modern flat in London, surrounded by concrete and glass and the comforting anonymity of the city. I avoid antiques now, particularly mirrors. I keep my walls deliberately bare. But sometimes, on nights like this when rain falls heavily against the windows, I think I hear voices in its rhythm whispering, pleading, threatening. And in the darkened surfaces of my windows, in the polished steel of my kitchen appliances, in the screen of my phone when it's turned off, I glimpse faces watching me, hands reaching for me, not trapped now, free, hunting. They found a way through when the mirror shattered, not into our world, not physically, but they left echoes, fragments, seeds planted in the fertile soil of human consciousness. I see them everywhere now, and once you've seen them, once you know they're there, they can see you too. Listen to the rain. Really listen. Can you hear them whispering your name? Don't look too long into darkened glass. Don't touch your reflection. And if you ever find a mirror with faces carved into its frame, for God's sake, leave it covered. Leave it alone. Some prisons are meant to stay locked. Some boundaries never crossed. Once broken, they can never be repaired. Once seen, they can never be unseen. The rain is getting heavier. They're getting louder. Can you hear them yet?